So we're going to wrap up our conversation about close relationships by discussing attachment theory, which is a framework that tries to understand the deepest roots of our desire to be close to other people. And attachment theory actually identifies these roots as tracing back to our earliest interactions with caregivers. Now, as we explore attachment theory, we're going to look at three central questions. First, we're going to try to answer the question of why we even have this strong desire for close relationships in the first place. Second, why different people can experience close relationships so differently, with different expectations and different comfort zones in terms of closeness. And finally, looking at whether you can trace these later individual differences in how we experience relationships back to these early experiences with caregivers. So before we get any deeper into the nitty-gritty of the attachment theory framework, I think it's actually really useful to understand what came before it. In the middle of the last century, the 1940s and the 1950s, there was actually a lot of interest in trying to understand the bond between mothers and children. And researchers who were studying this were often informed by psychoanalytic traditions or behaviorist traditions. And in both cases, these researchers thought that what looked like a really loving relationship might actually be all about food. In other words, the most primal and universal need that the child has is to avoid starving. And the experience of having his or her hunger satiated is often associated with mom, whether through breastfeeding or bottle feeding. So this very basic pleasure of having hunger relieved rubs off on the experience of being around mom, and that results in what looks like a really loving, warm, affectionate relationship. So this is the intellectual milieu that John Bowlby stepped into. John Bowlby is the forefather of attachment theory, and he had a suspicion that this original account was a little bit too simplistic. So to understand where Bowlby was coming from, I think it's also helpful to understand a little bit about the ecosystem that John Bowlby was operating in. John Bowlby's early life roughly paralleled World War II and its aftermath. And I think we all know that World War II involved a lot of geopolitical disruption, including a lot of young children who were actually evacuated from their cities or countries, moved to other regions so they could be safe from harm, and as a result were separated from their primary caregivers. Unfortunately, there were also a lot of children who were orphaned, and so who ended up being cared for in institutions rather than in the context of a single primary caregiver. And in both cases, these children who had temporary separations or permanent separations from a primary caregiver often experienced a lot of dysfunction in terms of their social and emotional development. So here's one thing that's really important. These kids had a roof over their head, a warm place to sleep, and access to basic nutrition. So if the most basic biological impulse was just getting fed, then these kids should have been A-OK. But there was something else that was missing. And John Bowlby looked at this data and thought there must be something really important about that stable, long-term emotional connection to a caregiver. So he concluded that that actual process of being emotionally connected to another person itself is a basic biological need. Okay, why would that be? Well, it turns out as a little tiny kid, having an emotional attachment to a caregiver is really useful. If we know anything about young children, it's that they are born, human babies are born vulnerable and squishy. We don't have sharp claws, sharp teeth, hooves. We can't even walk when we're born. This leaves us very vulnerable. And this means that if you want to have a fighting chance of surviving, of getting fed, of not dying of exposure, you need an older, wiser, stronger person who is invested in protecting you. In other words, it's important to maintain proximity to a caregiver. And so John Bowlby's central insight is that if this is so biologically crucial, Little kids should have some kind of inborn mechanism for maintaining that proximity to a caregiver. He thought that this looked something like this. It's what he called the attachment behavioral system. And it's basically a cognitive mechanism where little kids are often asking the question of whether their attachment figure is sufficiently close by, paying attention, and able to help out if needed. So the little kid subconsciously, non-verbally, is asking this question. They look around and they're trying to see if mom or dad or grandma or grandpa is close by. If the answer is yes, then hallelujah, all is well. The little kid can feel secure and content. They can put their energy towards other important tasks like exploring, playing, socializing with other little kids. But if the kid is scanning the environment and mom or dad or grandpa are not around, well, this is very distressing. This results in anxiety. And we've all seen this happen. Triggers a child to engage in behaviors that are designed to reestablish proximity. You can probably think of some ways that kids are likely to do this, right? If mom or dad walks away, a kid might start crying or wailing or throwing a tantrum, but this is not necessarily the only strategy that's likely to be successful. Little kids can use strategies that range on a spectrum from being louder and more obnoxious to more withdrawn, more sullen, and quieter. And different strategies work for different parents, right? Imagine a situation where a young child has parents who are really overwhelmed and stressed out. And for those parents, maybe the child crying actually stresses them out even more. Maybe you have parents who leave the room when the child cries, maybe even punish the child for being so vocally distressed. In that case, crying doesn't increase their chances of receiving the care they need, it actually backfires. So that child might learn to be more subdued. And as children have these repeated interactions with their parents and start to learn what works and doesn't work, these initial strategies can solidify into a stable style that the child has in terms of how they react to separation and how they react to stressful situations. We owe the majority of what we know about these individual differences in what are called attachment styles to a woman named Mary Ainsworth. Mary Ainsworth developed one of the first paradigms for assessing attachment style in young children, and this was called the strange situation. So this paradigm involved a primary caregiver. At the time this research was conducted, this was usually the mother, and their child coming in to Mary Ainsworth's lab. They were set up in a comfortable room, had a couple of chairs, some artwork, a bunch of toys in the middle of the room, and they were given a few minutes to get settled in. Now, I'm going to simplify a little bit, but crucially, the mom would eventually leave the room. So after the kid has gotten acclimated and started to play and get comfortable, mom will leave. And she will stay outside the room, out of reach of the child, for a couple of minutes, enough to stress out this young kid. So we're going to see a couple examples of this and how little kids respond to the situation differently in a video that's coming right up.
This experiment, which I watched through a two-way mirror, is designed to gauge how secure is the crucial relationship between mother and child.
Okay, this bunny is going to go here, and that bunny will be on top.
The value of the test has been established in studies that would watch a child, 1-year-old, and then follow it up and interview them about their relationships to their parents when they were 21 years old. So we're quite confident in the long-term significance of this relationship.
Peter, that's Peter.
After several minutes' play, the mother is signaled to leave the room.
Sweetie, I'll be back in 1 minute, okay? I'll get you back in 1 minute.
But she'll survive. The key moment in the experiment is the child's reaction to her mother's return.
Hi. It's okay.
The important clue is whether the baby's able to become calmed down by the contact with the mother and get back to play. Sometimes it takes a couple of minutes. But you see, when the mother was out, she was only interested in the mother, no interest in the toys. Now she has a contact with the mother. She's beginning to show a little interest in the environment, and shortly she'll be right back with the toys where we started.
So you would call this a secure one?
Yes, yes.
She's certainly much happier.
Goes to the door following her. Now, we sent the mother right back in, but the point here is not to distress the baby. We're just trying to challenge it. The baby puts her hands to her face in a sad expression, puts her face down. When she picks her up, she keeps her head down, her arms out, and then she sits in the chair holding the baby. The baby's still sullen. He's low-keyed.
So you would call this insecure attachment?
Yes, insecure. He's avoidant. He's not engaging her, and it's not the reunion's not effective. And it's important to remember here that the thing that upset him was her absence. Her return should be the solution to his problem. Now this is another pattern that we see in babies who are not good at using their mother as a secure base at home. This baby is also insecure. But you'll see, we got a look at his play before the separation. The mother's left, and when she returns, she picks him up. He can't calm down. He's still upset. She offers a toy to amuse him or to comfort him or to distract him, and he slaps it away. She offers another. He slaps it away. He's angry. We call these babies resistant or ambivalent because they both want her back and yet can't use the contact. We think that the difficulty is that in the past, when he sought comfort, she's been inconsistent as to whether she's available and responsive or not.
Okay, so if nothing else, you should have taken away from that video that different young children respond to the strange situation very differently. It turns out that the most typical response to this situation is for a child to have kind of a balanced reaction. We call these children secure, and in the strange situation, they are likely to show kind of moderate signs of missing the caregiver, of being distressed when the caregiver originally leaves. But crucially, these children are able to calm down quickly when mom or dad comes back. In other words, they seek proximity to mom or dad, they show affection, they're able to use mom or dad's presence as calming, and soon enough, they're back to playing and engaging with the environment. And this really desirable, secure style is argued to be the product of parenting that is consistently responsive. This is when you have parents where the little kid cries or skins her knee, and mom or dad is right there. They're available, giving warm, affectionate responses, and they're there when you need them. Now, you can contrast these secure children with the kids who are much more subdued. We call these children avoidant. Now, these are children who are likely to show weaker signs of missing the caregiver in the first place, meaning when mom leaves the room, these children might not be vocally upset. And most importantly, when the caregiver comes back, these avoidant children don't use mom or dad as a source of comfort. They keep their distance. It's not that they're necessarily back to being a-okay. They might still be subdued or upset or not engaging with the environment, but they're not wanting to use mom or dad as a source of comfort. And this is argued to be the product of parenting that is consistent, but in the other direction. This is consistently unresponsive parenting. Like we talked about earlier, this might be a mom or a dad who actually punishes the kid for crying. These parents lack sensitivity to their children's signals. They might encourage emotional distance. And this is markedly different than what we see from another insecure attachment style, which is anxiety, or as the video labels it, resistant or ambivalent. And these anxious, insecure children are likely to have a really exaggerated emotional response through multiple phases of the strange situation. So these children are likely to get extra distressed when mom or dad first leaves the room. And even more importantly, these children have a really hard time calming down, even when their caregiver returns. And this is argued to be the product of parenting that is inconsistent. It might waver between really warm and involved parenting and withdrawn and emotionally distant parenting. So sometimes when these kids are upset or scared, mom and dad are right there. But other times, their parents might be unavailable. And what this means is that for these little kids, it's hard to predict how their caregivers are going to react. Now, you can imagine that this is probably distressing and scary, right? But it also trains these kids to continue escalating their signals of distress. Because if crying the first time doesn't work, if mom or dad is still distant, well, you never know when the switch is going to flip, and you might get the version of mom or dad that's more responsive and more affectionate. Now, just an interim summary. We have learned so far that little kids are motivated to keep their caregivers close at hand. This has survival value. And that they learn how to do this by paying attention to what works for their caregivers. Now, again, across repeated interactions, this evolves into something a little bit bigger and broader than just whether you cry a lot or are subdued. In these interactions with caregivers, little children are learning what other people are like. Are other people affectionate and reliable, or inconsistent or distant? You could even argue that little kids are learning lessons about themselves. Do I seem to be somebody who is worthy of love? And these styles can have ripple effects even beyond childhood. So what we see is that insecurity in younger children tends to also have consequences for health and well-being and social relationships later in life. Children who are securely attached to their parents tend to have better grades, more executive control, stronger peer relationships. But it's not just that being more secure tends to help you be happier and healthier. It's also that this style of relating in relationships tends to translate into our teen years and our adulthood. So, in the very same way that you can have securely attached, anxiously attached, and avoidantly attached little children, you can also have securely attached, anxiously attached, and avoidantly attached adults. And these folks have very different habits and styles in intimate relationships. So let's take a whirlwind tour of what these styles look like in adulthood. In terms of attachment security, these are adults who tend to have pretty positive views of both themselves and of other people. These are folks who feel like they are worthy of love, but also that other people are safe and can be relied upon. And this results in these adults both being comfortable with being really intimate with other people, because you can be vulnerable and you can expose yourself and still trust that other people will be responsive, right? But at the same time, secure adults also tend to be comfortable with having some degree of autonomy in their relationships. Because let's say you're dating somebody and you spend a little bit of time apart, you can trust that that person can be independent without necessarily rejecting you or leaving you. Now, this is very different than what we see from attachment avoidant adults. These folks tend to have issues with the closeness part of that spectrum. They feel uncomfortable being really vulnerable or intimate. And instead, they would prefer to stay really independent and have a lot of self-sufficiency. They don't necessarily trust that other people are going to be responsive or reliable if they're vulnerable with those other individuals. Now, you also see characteristic relationship problems for people who are attachment anxious, but in the other direction. These folks are less comfortable with the autonomy and the independence. Instead, they crave closeness and intimacy. They want to be really like fused with other people. And this stems from really being concerned about a partner's love, availability, and responsiveness. In other words, always worrying that other people might reject them. If you want to dig a little deeper into these different attachment styles in adulthood, there's a video I highly recommend you check out. It's linked on Moodle. It's called What is Your Attachment Style?